70. That's the number of healings the Catholic Church has officially recognized as miracles at Lourdes in southern France, out of something like 7,000 cures reported there since 1858. 70 out of 7,000. And to get on that list, a case has to survive a medical review board, the Bureau of Medical Observations, founded in 1883, staffed by physicians, many of whom aren't Catholic, whose entire job is to say, we can't explain this, or, far more often, we can. Sit with what that means for a second. A religious institution built a screening committee whose default answer is no. That's the modern world's relationship with the word. A miracle is the thing left over after the doctors have run out of explanations. It's the exception, the break in the pattern, the moment the machinery of nature stops for a second and something reaches in. And here's what got me digging, and what this whole investigation is about. That definition, the one almost every American carries around, believer or not, is roughly 275 years old. It's younger than the United States. And the Hebrew Bible, the book most of us learn the miracle stories from, has no word for it at all. None. Not a word that means an event that breaks the laws of nature. The Encyclopedia Judaica puts it flatly. Hebrew has no term corresponding to the English word miracle. What the Hebrew Bible has instead are signs, wonders, and mighty acts. And those three words are doing something completely different from what you were taught they were doing. So this is going to be a dig, and we're going to run it backwards. Start at the surface, at the hospital chart and the church prayer chain, and go down one layer at a time, through the 17th century, through the church fathers, through Rome, through the Greek of the Gospels, all the way to the Hebrew underneath. And at every layer, the word changes shape in your hands. If you like this kind of thing, slow, careful, source by source, subscribe and hit like. That's genuinely the whole ask, and it's what decides whether the next person who's curious about this ever sees it. Let's start where you already live. You know how this sounds in American English. The praise report section of the Sunday Bulletin. The prayer chain that used to be a phone tree and is now a group text or a church Facebook page. Linda's biopsy came back clean. Praise God. The pastor in the surgical waiting room at 3 in the afternoon. Somebody's aunt saying the doctors couldn't explain it, about a scan that came back different than expected. And on cable, the healing crusade, the line of people at the front, the hand on the forehead, the fall backward, the catchers in matching polo shirts. Every one of those runs on the same underlying assumption that God's fingerprints show up in the gap. Where medicine stops, God starts. Where the explanation runs out, that's the doorway. Now, that instinct is old and it's human, and there's nothing stupid about it. People have always looked hardest for the sacred at the edge of what they understand. But it is not the assumption the Hebrew Bible runs on, not even close. And the gap between the two isn't a scandal or a cover-up. It's a translation history and a philosophy history, and we can trace both of them with dates. The first shovel goes in at 1748. That's the year David Hume published his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and in section 10, he wrote the sentence that has defined the argument ever since. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Read it again slowly, because there's a phrase in there doing enormous work. Laws of nature. That concept, nature as a system running on fixed, universal mathematical laws, is not ancient. It's a product of the 1600s. Descartes was writing about the laws of nature in the 1640s. Newton's Principia, the book that made the whole picture stick, came out in 1687. Before that, educated people talked about natures, plural, the tendency of a heavy thing to fall, the tendency of fire to rise. Not a single legal code holding the cosmos together, which creates a real problem for how we read old texts. Hume's definition needs a law book to violate. The people who wrote Exodus didn't have one. You cannot break a rule that hasn't been written yet. So when someone today asks, "Do you believe in miracles?" the question already carries 17th century physics inside it, and 18th century philosophy, and then it gets pointed at a text from the ancient Near East that was working with an entirely different picture of how the world holds together. It's a little like handing someone a photograph and asking whether the megapixel count is accurate. Something else worth knowing about that definition: it was aimed at a target. Hume was writing into an argument that had been running for a century, in which Christian apologists used miracles as proof, the resurrection and the healings as the evidence that authenticated the whole system. He was attacking the proof. His opponents had picked that ground. He fought them on it. And the definition both sides agreed on is the one American Christianity inherited whole, which is why the argument in your family group chat about whether miracles are real still has an 18th century shape. Now go back one layer. 78 years before Hume, in 1670, a book came out in Amsterdam with a fake publisher's name on the title page and no author listed, and inside it, chapter 6 was titled, Of Miracles. Baruch Spinoza wrote that chapter, and there's a moment in it that I find more revealing than any of his arguments. Near the end, he stops and tells the reader that he changed his method. He says he handled miracles differently than he handled prophecy earlier in the same book. For prophecy, he'd worked only from what he could gather out of Scripture itself, because the subject demanded it. For miracles, he worked from reason, because the question was a different kind of question. That's a man showing his work, not delivering conclusions from a height, telling you which tool he used and why he switched. If you've ever read someone who does that, you know how rare it is and how much it earns your trust. And his argument in that chapter is not the one people expect. He doesn't say miracles are lies. He says something much stranger and, in its own way, much more reverent. His reasoning goes like this. If the order of nature is God's own doing, if the regularities of the world flow from the divine nature itself, then an event that broke that order would be God acting against God. He calls that an obvious absurdity, which means, in his reading, the more you actually understand how nature works, the more you understand God, not less. He says it about as directly as a person can. Our knowledge of God increases in proportion to our knowledge of nature. That's the lens for everything that follows, not explain the wonder away, relocate it. And Spinoza gives us a working rule, which is the actual tool we're going to use for the rest of this dig. To understand a miracle story, he says, you have to know the opinions of the people who first told it, and you have to separate their opinions from what they actually saw. Otherwise, you'll mistake their picture of the world for the event itself. He demonstrates it on a passage that anybody who went to Sunday school remembers. In the book of Joshua, the sun stands still over Gibeon so the battle can be finished. Spinoza's point isn't that nothing happened. His point is that the people telling that story believed the sun moved across a fixed earth. That was their physics. So when the day ran long, for whatever reason, a long day happened, they described it inside the only cosmos they had. The sun stopped. He says they related it as something quite different from what really occurred, not out of dishonesty, but because a report is always shaped by the reporter's picture of the world. Now, watch what happens when you turn that rule on the most famous scene in the Hebrew Bible. Every American who's ever had a television has the image. Charlton Heston on the beach, arms up, the water standing in two green walls. It runs on TV around Easter, and it has for 70 years. Or, if your church did flannel graph, you remember the two blue felt halves and the little paper Israelites in between, and how the teacher would peel the sea apart with her hand, while 30 kids on a rug held their breath. Here's what the text says. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 21, the King James reads, "And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided by a strong east wind all that night." The narrator put the mechanism in the sentence, not a hand from the clouds, a wind from a specific compass direction, blowing for a specific duration. Spinoza noticed this in the 1600s and pointed at it. The sea opened by an east wind that blew hard all night. He also pointed out that in the poem 2 chapters later, the Song of Moses, the wind shows up again on the other side of the event. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them, while the prose account of the water returning leaves the wind out. Same event, 2 tellings, one keeps the mechanism and one drops it. And dropping it, he says, is what makes the story feel bigger. That's not a scholar attacking scripture. That's a careful reader noticing that the text is more interesting than the summary. And there's a translation layer under it too. The Hebrew phrase is Yam Suf, which most Hebraists read as Sea of Reeds, a marshy body of water, not the deep Red Sea we picture. The Greek translators of the Septuagint, working in Egypt starting in the 3rd century before the Common Era, rendered it with the words for the Red Sea, and that's what came down through Latin into English. Some scholars defend the traditional identification. Others argue for a reed marsh in the eastern Nile Delta. That debate is live and honest, but the plain fact is that the English phrase you grew up with is a translation choice made by real people in a real century. Since Spinoza wrote those 2 chapters back to back, and since the prophecy chapter is where his whole method gets built, there's a video here on the channel called What Prophecy Actually Meant in the Ancient World that walks the same trail from the other side, how the job of the prophet looked in the actual archives of the ancient Near East. If you haven't sat with that one yet, it pairs with this almost perfectly. Now let's go down another layer, because the definition Hume made famous, miracle as broken law, doesn't hold up in the 5th century either. Augustine of Hippo, writing The City of God in the 400s, deals with this directly in Book 21, Chapter 8. You've probably seen the short version floating around on a church bulletin or a coffee mug. Miracles are not contrary to nature, but only contrary to what we know about nature. That's a paraphrase, and I want to be straight with you about that. It's a tidied-up version that circulates far more than the original. But the original says something very close, and it's better. Augustine asks how anything could be contrary to nature when it happens by the will of God, since the will of the Creator is the nature of each created thing. A portent, he says, happens not contrary to nature, but contrary to a nature known to us. Contrary to a nature known to us. Not contrary to nature. The limit is in our knowledge. So one of the most influential theologians in the history of Christianity, more than 1,000 years before Newton, held a position closer to Spinoza's than to the one most American churches teach on Sunday. That's not a gotcha. It's a reminder that the popular version of a doctrine and the technical version have been drifting apart from each other for as long as there have been doctrines, because teaching has to simplify, and simplification is how ideas travel. Keep going down. Now we're in the Roman world, and the picture gets genuinely surprising, because the ancient Mediterranean was absolutely saturated with reported wonders, and they had a whole civic apparatus for handling them. The Romans called them prodigies, a statue sweating, a rain of stones, a bull that spoke. Livy's history is full of them, and there's a whole surviving compilation, the Book of Prodigies, attributed to Julius Obsequens, that reads like a catalog of the weird. And here's the part that reframes things. These weren't private spiritual experiences. They were reported to the Senate. The Senate evaluated them, decided which ones counted, and ordered the appropriate religious response. A 9-day rite, a sacrifice, a purification, a government committee reviewing supernatural claims and rejecting most of them, 2,000 years before the medical bureau at Lourdes was doing the same thing. The Greek world had its healing shrines, and we can still read the advertising. At Epidaurian, the sanctuary of the healing god Asclepius, they carved testimonials into stone tablets, the Iamata, which just means the cures. 4 of those stelae survive from the 4th century before the Common Era, with something like 70 accounts on them. A man blind in one eye, a woman pregnant for 5 years, a paralyzed hand. The pattern is almost always the same. The sick person sleeps in the sanctuary, has a dream, the god appears and touches or operates, and the person wakes up whole. Nobody carved those to deceive anyone. They were put up the way a church puts testimonies in the newsletter. This happened here, and here's who it happened to. And that's the thing to hold on to as we keep digging. Miracle accounts in the ancient world weren't rare, weren't uniquely Jewish or uniquely Christian, and weren't treated as impossible. They were a normal category of experience with recognized conventions, which means an ancient audience heard them very differently than you do. Here's the one that stops people cold, and it comes from a Roman historian nobody would call gullible. Tacitus, in Book 4 of his Histories, chapter 81, tells this story. Vespasian is in Alexandria in the year 69 or 70 of the Common Era, in the middle of his rise to emperor. A blind man from the city throws himself at Vespasian's feet, begging to be healed, saying the god Serapis sent him. Another man with a ruined hand asks the same. Vespasian is skeptical. Tacitus says he hesitated, consulted physicians, worried about looking foolish. Then he does it. Spit on the eyes, step on the hand. Both men are healed. And Tacitus, who is not exactly a soft touch, adds a line that historians have chewed on for centuries, that people who were there still tell the story even now, when there's nothing to be gained by lying. Suetonius reports the same episode independently. Now, why does this matter for reading scripture? Not for the reason a certain kind of internet argument wants it to matter. The point is not that anybody borrowed from anybody. The point is about vocabulary and expectation. Because in the Gospel of Mark, twice, Jesus heals using saliva. In the 7th chapter, a deaf man, he puts his fingers in the man's ears, spits, touches his tongue. In the 8th chapter, a blind man at Bethsaida, he spits on the man's eyes, and the healing happens in 2 stages. The man first seeing people who look like walking trees, then seeing clearly. Saliva shows up because saliva was in the medical toolkit of that entire world. Pliny the Elder, writing his natural history in the same century, devotes long stretches of Book 28 to the healing properties people attributed to human spit. It was a known therapeutic gesture, the way we'd think of ice on a sprain. So a 1st century audience hearing about a healer who spits isn't hearing physics get broken. They're hearing something they recognize, done by someone they're being told to pay attention to. The gesture is ordinary. The claim being made is about the person. Which brings us to the actual words the Gospels use, and this is where the dig starts paying off. The Greek New Testament does not have a word for miracle either. What it has is 3 words: semeion, se, meon, which means sign, dynamis, dunamis, which means power or an act of power. It's the root of our word dynamite, and teres, plural, terata, meaning a wonder or a portent, which in the New Testament almost never appears by itself. It shows up bolted to signs as signs and wonders. Look at what those words are actually describing. A sign points at something. An act of power demonstrates something about the one doing it. A wonder names the reaction in the crowd. Not one of the 3 says anything about natural law being suspended. They're all about meaning and effect. The Gospel of John is the clearest case because John counts them. The water into wine at Cana is called, in the King James, this beginning of miracles, but the Greek word there is signs. And near the end, in the 20th chapter, John states his purpose out loud. Many other signs did Jesus, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe. The author tells you the signs are in there to point. That's the job description from the writer himself. If this is landing for you, hit like, and if there's somebody in your life who's been quietly wrestling with this exact question, send it over, not to argue with them, just because it's a better conversation than the one they've probably been having. Now the Hebrew layer, which is the deepest one and the strangest, the main word is ought, a short plain word meaning sign, and the Hebrew Bible uses it for things that have nothing to do with the supernatural. The rainbow after the flood is an ought. The Sabbath is called an ought between God and Israel. Circumcision is an ought. In the book of Genesis, the mark placed on Cain is an ought. Even the stars in the 1st chapter of Genesis are set in the sky for signs and seasons. Same word. A weekly day of rest and the plagues of Egypt sit in the same category, which tells you the category was never impossible event. The category was something that carries meaning. The second word is mophet, fate, usually rendered wonder or portent, and it travels in pairs with ought, signs and wonders. Then there's niflaot, which comes from a root meaning to be extraordinary or hard, and gets translated as wondrous works, and geverot, mighty acts. And then there's the word modern Hebrew actually uses for miracle today, nes. In biblical Hebrew, nes means a pole, a standard, a banner you raise up so people can see it from a distance. In the book of Numbers, when Moses is told to put the bronze serpent up where the people can look at it, the thing he puts it on is a nes. The King James says a pole. The word that now means miracle originally meant a flagpole. I don't know a cleaner illustration of what this whole family of words was doing. A flag doesn't defy anything. A flag is visible from far away, and it means something to the people who know what it stands for. That's the ancient logic of the sign. It's not about the mechanism, it's about visibility and meaning. And once you see that, the Hebrew Bible starts making an argument it's very hard to hear through the modern definition. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 13. This is the passage Spinoza pulled out, and it's remarkable. The text says, if a prophet comes to you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder actually comes to pass, and then he says, let's go serve other gods, do not listen to him. Put him to death. Read the logic there. The text concedes the sign worked. It happened, and it says that changes nothing about whether the message is true. Scripture, in its own voice, is telling you that a wonder is not proof. Spinoza's comment on this is dry and correct. False prophets can work wonders, so wonders can't establish anything by themselves. Then there's the moment in the Gospel of Mark, in the 8th chapter, where the Pharisees come asking for a sign from heaven. The King James says Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and said no sign would be given to that generation, and he walks away from them. Whatever else is going on in that scene, the Jesus of Mark's Gospel refuses to play the proof game. He's not interested in the demonstration, so the sign as evidence framework, the one that got built up in the 17th and 18th centuries and then handed to American Christianity as its main apologetic, is the framework these ancient texts are, in several places, actively pushing against. That's not a small thing to find at the bottom of a dig. Now let's watch a miracle story actually grow, because we have the manuscripts to do it, and this is where it stops being theory. Most scholars hold that Mark was written first, somewhere around the year 70 of the Common Era, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. That's the standard model. There are dissenters. A minority argue for Matthew's priority, but the majority position is well established, and it lets you compare versions of the same event. So compare them. In Mark's 5th chapter, Jesus meets one demon-possessed man in the tombs. In Matthew's 8th chapter, the same episode has two men. In Mark's 10th chapter, one blind man at Jericho, and he has a name, Bartimaeus. In Matthew's 20th chapter, two blind men, no names. Matthew doubles. He does it more than once, and scholars have argued about why for a long time. One common suggestion is the requirement in Deuteronomy that a matter be established by two witnesses. Another is that Matthew compressed two of Mark's separate healing scenes into one. Traditional harmonizers argue there really were two men, and Mark only mentioned the one who mattered. All of those are on the table. What isn't in dispute is that the accounts differ, and that the differences follow patterns, which is exactly what Spinoza said to look for, not lies. The fingerprints of a person telling a story for a purpose, to a particular community with particular concerns. And if you want to see where that process goes when nothing restrains it, look at the infancy Gospel of Thomas, a Christian text most scholars date to the 2nd century. It's about Jesus as a small child. In it, the boy Jesus makes 12 sparrows out of clay on the Sabbath, claps his hands, and they fly away. He also strikes another child dead for bumping into him, then later brings him back. That text was never accepted into the New Testament. The church rejected it, and rejected it early, but it circulated widely. It got translated into a pile of languages, and its stories show up in medieval art and in the Quran's account of Jesus animating clay birds. It's proof, in manuscript form, that miracle narratives were a living, growing genre in early Christianity, and that communities exercised judgment about which ones to keep. Meanwhile, in Jewish tradition of the same general period, you find holy men doing the same kinds of things. The Mishnah, in the tractate Tanit, tells about Honi the circle drawer, a man in the 1st century before the Common Era who was asked to pray for rain during a drought. He drew a circle in the dirt, stood in it, and told God he wouldn't move until it rained. It rained. Then he negotiated about the amount. There's also Hanina ben Dosa, remembered in rabbinic sources as a healer who could tell from the quality of his prayer whether a sick person would recover. The historian Geza Vermes, who taught at Oxford, argued in his 1973 book, Jesus the Jew, that these figures give us the right category for understanding the historical Jesus, the charismatic Galilean holy man, a recognized type within Judaism. Vermes's thesis has been challenged plenty. Other scholars think he leaned too hard on later rabbinic material to describe the 1st century, but the underlying observation holds. A Jewish healer and rainmaker in that world was not an alien phenomenon. He was working inside a tradition his neighbors would have recognized. Here's the turn, and it's the thing I keep coming back to. Every layer we've dug through tells the same story from a different angle. The ancient world did not have a category called the impossible. What it had was a world thick with divine activity all the way through, where the unusual and the ordinary were both God's doing, and the difference between them was a difference of attention, not of physics. The modern definition tradition put a wall down the middle of that world. On one side, nature, running on its own, God free. On the other side, the exceptions, where God gets to act. And then, this is the part that costs people something. As science explained more and more of the first side, the second side kept shrinking. That's why so many people who grew up in church describe faith as feeling like a losing retreat. It wasn't because the evidence turned against them. It was because they'd inherited a definition that guaranteed the retreat. If God only lives in the unexplained, then every explanation is a loss. Spinoza saw that trap and named it in 1670, and his line about it is genuinely funny. He says, people who run to the will of God whenever they can't explain something are just expressing their ignorance in a ridiculous way, not because there's no God in it, because they've got the direction backwards. On his account, the parts of the world you understand clearly have a better claim to be called the works of God than the parts you're totally in the dark about. And this pattern runs through every tradition with old texts and long memories. Islamic scholars have debated for centuries how to read the miraculous reports in Hadith and what the Quran means when it calls its own verses ayat, signs, the same idea as the Hebrew ot. Hindu commentators have argued about the literal and symbolic reading of divine acts in the epics since long before Europe had the argument. In the Latter-day Saint tradition and among Jehovah's Witnesses and in Catholic canonization procedure, the same question keeps getting worked out with different vocabulary. Nobody is exempt. Any tradition that keeps a text long enough will eventually have to ask what its ancestors meant by a word. The mechanism is always the same, and it's not sinister. Words drift across languages. Translations get made and become the version people memorize. Popular teaching simplifies scholarly debate because it has to. You can't teach 50 kids on a Sunday morning about the semantic range of ot. Philosophical fashions from 1 century get read backward into texts from 10 centuries earlier. None of that requires anybody to have hidden anything. It only requires time. And what you get by digging through it isn't less. That's the part I'd hand you if I could only hand you one thing. The person who learns that Exodus says the wind blew all night hasn't lost the sea crossing. They've gained a narrator, a specific human being, in a specific century, standing on a shore, reaching for words. Let me be honest about the limits here, because a dig like this can start feeling like it settles more than it settles. None of this tells you whether anything happened. Spinoza has an argument that the order of nature can't be broken, and it's a real philosophical argument, but it rests on his particular view of God and nature, the view he spent the ethics building, where God and nature are not two separate things. Plenty of serious philosophers and theologians have rejected that starting point, in his own time and since. His conclusion follows from his premise, and the premise is contested. Anybody who tells you he proved miracles impossible is skipping a step. What the historical work does establish is narrower, and, I'd argue, more useful. It tells you what the words meant to the people who used them. It tells you that sign was not a synonym for violation. It tells you the reported wonder was a common feature of the ancient Mediterranean, evaluated by Roman senators and carved on Greek stone and debated by rabbis. And it tells you that the framework in which a miracle functions as proof of a religion's truth is a late development that some of the biblical texts themselves resist. That's a lot to be able to say with dates and documents attached. And it opens up a way of reading that I think most people never got offered. When you come to a wonder story now, you get to ask better questions than, did it happen? You get to ask, what is this sign pointing at? Who was the original audience, and what would they have heard? What was the narrator's picture of the world, and where does that picture leave marks on the sentence? Take the plagues in Exodus, read them as signs, and the whole sequence changes character. The Nile turning to blood, the darkness, the death of the firstborn. Each one lands on something the Egyptians held sacred: the river, the sun, the ruling house. Many scholars read the whole sequence as a contest, argued out symbol by symbol, over who actually runs the world. That reading doesn't require you to decide anything about the mechanics. It requires you to notice what the signs are aimed at. Or take Elijah on Mount Carmel in the first book of Kings. It's usually preached as a fireworks display, but look at how the story is built. It's a public test, staged with rules agreed in advance, in front of witnesses, and the whole point is a question about which God is real. The narrative form is closer to a legal proceeding than a magic show. Spinoza's rule keeps earning its keep here. Know the opinions of the people who told the story and separate their opinions from the event. Do that, and the text gets richer, not thinner. You stop reading a list of impossible things and start reading people, arguing, remembering, praising, making a case. Anyone who sat through enough Sunday school knows the flattened version. The stories arrive as a set of proofs, lined up in order, each one demonstrating that God is powerful. What almost nobody gets told is that the ancient texts are doing something far more layered and far more interesting than proving a point. That gap between the flattened version and the actual text is not somebody's fault. It's what happens when a text is loved by 100 generations. But you don't have to stay on the flattened side of it, and the fact that you went looking says your mind is doing exactly what a mind should do. So what does a person actually get to keep? Spinoza's answer is the one I want to put in front of you, because it's the least understood part of him and the most generous. He was not trying to shrink the world. His argument was that the order of nature is not a machine God stands outside of. It's the way God's own nature expresses itself, continuously, everywhere, without interruption. On that view, there's nowhere you can look that isn't the thing itself. The wind blowing across a marsh at night is not less divine than a hand reaching out of the sky. It's the same reality, described accurately instead of dramatically. And in the Ethics, his last and hardest book, he takes that all the way. He argues that the highest thing a human being can do is understand, and that understanding things through their causes, seeing how they follow from the whole, produces a kind of joy he calls the intellectual love of God. Not a cold consolation prize, he puts it at the top. The mind's blessedness, in his system, is the act of understanding itself. Which means, if he's right, that the hours you spend trying to figure out what a word meant in the 8th century before the Common Era aren't a detour away from the sacred, they're the practice. You can disagree with him, a lot of people have, including people who admired him enormously. But there's something in that account worth having even if you don't sign the whole contract. The wonder doesn't have to live in the gap. It never had to. The gap was a 17th century floor plan, and you're allowed to walk out of the room. And notice what stays standing after all of it. A community of people, 3,000 years ago, decided that the most important thing they could say about their own escape from slavery was that it wasn't only weather. Whatever happened at that water, they refused to file it under coincidence. They said the wind meant something. That's a claim about meaning, made by people who knew perfectly well that wind is wind, and they wrote the wind into the sentence anyway, which is how we know they weren't hiding it. That's not a small or naive act. That's a whole civilization insisting that its life had a shape. And Spinoza, at the end of his chapter on miracles, does something you almost never see from a philosopher with a strong position. He says everyone is free to think about this however they find best, however it serves their own devotion and their own single-hearted religion. Then he quotes Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, who said about the sea crossing that whether it happened by God's extraordinary will or by the course of nature, people are at liberty to think what they please. Two Jewish writers, 16 centuries apart, arriving at the same generosity. Here's what I'd want you to walk out with. Your curiosity about this was never the problem. The person who reads Exodus chapter 14 and notices the east wind sitting right there in the verse is reading better than the person who skips it. Noticing is not doubt. Noticing is literacy. And the questions you were maybe made to feel bad about, why does Matthew say 2 men and Mark say 1? Why does the text explain the mechanism? Why did the church at Lourdes reject 6,930 of 7,000 claims? Those are the questions the tradition's own best minds have been asking for 2,000 years. In Hebrew and Greek and Latin and Dutch. You're not outside the conversation. You're in the oldest part of it. What changes when you integrate this is the weight. You no longer have to defend a definition that was engineered in the wrong century for a text written in a different world. You no longer have to treat every scientific explanation as territory lost. And you get the actual texts back, messier, more human, more argumentative, full of narrators with opinions and communities with stakes and translators making choices at 3 in the morning. That's more than you started with. That's the whole point of doing this. If you want to keep going, subscribing is what makes the next one possible. And there's plenty of trail left, where the idea of the soul came from, how the Hebrew Bible got assembled, what the earliest Christians actually argued about, Hit like if this was worth your time, and if it made something click, pass it to the one person you know who'd rather understand a thing than win an argument about it. And since we spent this whole hike with one 17th century reader and the 2 chapters he wrote back to back, the companion piece is right here on the channel. What prophecy actually meant in the ancient world, where the same method gets turned on the prophets, using the clay tablets from Mari and the Assyrian oracles. It's worth walking through after this one. The 2 chapters were built to be read together, and so were the videos. Before you go, I want one thing from you in the comments, and I do read them. What's the miracle story you were told as a kid that stuck to you hardest? The one that shaped how you pictured God before you had words for any of this. Not whether you still believe it, just which one it was and what it looked like in your head. The east wind blew all night. Somebody was standing there in the dark, feeling it on their face, and decided it mattered enough to write down. And 3,000 years later, that's still the most remarkable thing on the page.